Most people who follow a budget end up with less money than people who do not. That sounds like it should not be true. Budgeting is the first piece of advice anyone gives about money. Track your spending. Know your numbers. Assign every dollar a category. It is so embedded in financial culture that questioning it feels almost irresponsible. Financial educators repeat it. Apps are built around it. Books are written about it. It is the foundation of nearly every personal finance conversation. But a growing body of behavioral research is pointing at something uncomfortable. The way most people budget, the way it is taught and promoted around the world, may actually be making their financial situation worse. Not because budgeting is wrong in principle, but because the popular version of it is built on a flawed assumption about how human beings actually behave with money. Here is what the data shows. The most widely promoted budgeting framework in the world is the 50-30-20 rule. 50% of take-home income goes to needs, 30% goes to wants, 20% goes to savings. It was popularized by Senator Elizabeth Warren and her co-author Amelia Warren Tyagi in their book, All Your Worth. The logic is clean, simple, easy to remember. 3 categories, 1 rule. Anyone can follow it. The problem is that most people do not live inside a spreadsheet. According to a 2026 report from Ramsey Solutions, 54% of households report living paycheck to paycheck, up from 42% just 5 years earlier. If a framework as widely adopted as the 50-30-20 rule were working, that number should be falling. It is not. It has risen steadily alongside increased access to budgeting apps, more financial content than any previous generation has had access to, and growing cultural awareness of personal finance. More budgeting advice. Worse outcomes. Something is breaking down between the advice and the reality. Behavioral economics offers a clear explanation for what. The first problem is structural. The 50-30-20 rule was designed for an economy where 50% of income could realistically cover housing, food, utilities, transportation, and basic debt obligations. That world is no longer the world most households live in. In major urban centers from Southeast Asia to Western Europe to North America, housing alone now consumes between 40 and 60% of take-home pay for a significant share of renters and mortgage holders. When the needs category exceeds the entire 50% allocation before utilities, groceries, or transportation have been counted, the framework collapses mathematically before a single dollar reaches savings. This is not a discipline problem. It is an arithmetic problem. And standard budgeting advice treats it like a discipline problem, which means people who are already under financial pressure end up feeling like failures when the math was never going to work in the first place. And that feeling is where the deeper damage begins. A study from the FINRA Investor Education Foundation documented that individuals under financial stress show measurably impaired decision-making around money. When anxiety increases, the brain allocates fewer cognitive resources to long-term planning and more to managing the immediate emotional experience. Short-term relief through spending becomes more appealing precisely when budgeting is supposed to be doing its most important work. The stress produced by a failing budget actively degrades the financial behavior the budget was designed to produce. This creates a loop that most budgeting advice does not acknowledge, and that loop is where months and years of progress disappear. The second problem is what behavioral researchers describe as the restriction rebound cycle. When a budget imposes hard spending limits on categories, the brain experiences this as deprivation. Consumer finance researchers use the phrase rebound spending to describe what follows. It functions the same way as a crash diet. The harder someone restricts, the more intensely the urge to compensate builds. One forbidden purchase becomes a signal that the entire system has failed, and the response is often a spending episode significantly larger than anything the original restriction was trying to prevent. This is not a personality flaw. It is a documented behavioral pattern. Research published in the Journal of Marketing Research by Jeffrey Larson of Brigham Young University and Ryan Hamilton of Emory University demonstrated something striking about how budgets affect purchasing behavior. When consumers imposed a spending limit on themselves before making a purchase, they actually spent more on average than consumers who set no limit at all. The act of setting a budget shifted their cognitive focus toward quality, leading them to choose higher-priced options they would have bypassed if no budget ceiling had been established. The budget did not constrain spending. It redirected attention in ways that increased it. The brain, when told it cannot have something, does not simply accept that instruction. It negotiates. And in that negotiation, the budget frequently loses. The third problem is what might be called the tracking illusion. The dominant model of personal finance instruction centers on monitoring where money goes after it has already been spent. Categorize each transaction, review the total at month's end, adjust next month accordingly. The assumption underlying this approach is that awareness produces behavior change. Behavioral research has consistently challenged that assumption. Retrospective tracking, looking at past spending after the fact, rarely alters the triggers that caused the spending in the first place. Most people who diligently track their spending do so for a few weeks and then abandon the practice, not from lack of discipline, but because reviewing historical data does not remove the real-time pressures that drive financial decisions in the moment. Nobel laureate Richard Thaler, whose foundational work on mental accounting helped shape modern behavioral economics, demonstrated that people do not treat money as a single interchangeable resource. They compartmentalize it based on origin and emotional context. Money from a salary is mentally categorized differently than money from a bonus. Money spent on a credit card is experienced differently than money spent in cash. This means a budget that treats all dollars identically is working against the deep architecture of how the human brain actually processes financial choices. Standard budgeting advice was not designed with any of this in mind. There is also what researchers call decision fatigue. The measurable decline in the quality of decisions after a person has made many choices in a row. Financial decisions are no exception. By the end of a long day or a stressful week or a month in which multiple financial obligations have collided, the capacity to enforce a budget is at its lowest point. Yet those are precisely the moments when budgets demand the most from people. This helps explain why people reliably make their worst financial choices under predictable conditions. Not from recklessness, from depletion. The willpower that a budget requires is a finite resource, and it competes with every other demand on a person's attention and emotional energy throughout the day. By the time the impulse buy happens, the budget might as well not exist. So what does the research actually support? The evidence points consistently toward one approach: not tracking, not categorizing, not reviewing. Automation. The strategy, known in behavioral economics as paying yourself first or reverse budgeting, inverts the entire model. Instead of earning, spending, and saving whatever remains, the savings decision is removed from the equation. A fixed portion of income transfers automatically to a savings or investment account at the moment a paycheck arrives, before any other spending begins. What remains is the spendable balance. There are no categories to track, no restrictions to resist, no willpower to exhaust. It works because of how it interacts with the brain's architecture rather than fighting it. When savings happen before spending begins, there is no conscious decision to override. There is no moment of temptation. There is no fatigue to deplete. The behavior executes automatically, and the remaining balance becomes the natural frame within which all other spending decisions occur. Researchers in behavioral finance describe this as changing the default, and studies examining household savings behavior across multiple countries have consistently found that automated savings systems produce significantly more consistent outcomes than budgeting systems that rely on manual decision-making and willpower. The scale of the difference matters. Consumer finance research tracking households using automated savings versus manual budgeting systems found that automation dramatically improved savings persistence over 12-month periods. Manual budgeting systems showed sharp drop-off rates as time progressed, and the initial motivation to change faded. Automated systems continued functioning regardless of motivation, stress levels, or how many other demands were competing for the household's attention. This is the reframe that mainstream financial advice has been slow to adopt. The goal is not to create a budget that a person can follow. The goal is to create a system that does not require a person to do anything after the initial setup. The discipline is in the design, not in the ongoing execution. What this looks like in practice is straightforward. Determine a savings amount, any amount, even a small one. Automate the transfer to occur on the same day income arrives. Build spending decisions around the balance that remains. Review the automation amount periodically as income changes. That is the entire system. No categories, no guilt, no tracking. The irony of the most popular budgeting advice is that it places the highest demands on human psychology at the exact moments when human psychology is least equipped to meet those demands. Behavioral economics did not discover this recently. The evidence has been building for decades across dozens of studies. The gap between what financial research supports and what mainstream financial advice promotes has simply remained stubbornly wide. For anyone who found this useful, passing it on is one of the simplest ways to give someone they know a head start that most people never receive. Content like this exists because people choose to support it. A like or a subscription is what keeps these ideas reaching the people who need them most. Here is where this ends. Most people who follow a budget end up with less money than people who do not. Not because budgeting is wrong, but because the version being taught was never designed for the way human beings actually behave with money. Until that changes, the advice itself remains part of the problem.